políticas. Categorizações políticas dos muçulmanos. Esse é outro campo onde examina criticamente os rótulos, tal como moderado e radical, frequentemente aplicado aos muçulmanos, argumentando que esses termos são frequentemente moldados pela mudança de agendas políticas, em vez de baseadas em diferenças teológicas e verídicas. As contribuições do professor Thomas Lindemann o estabelece como uma figura importante na psicologia da religião e suas pesquisas fornecem informações valiosas para compreender como a dinâmica religiosa pode conduzir não só ao conflito, mas também à construção da paz, oferecendo insights sobre a identidade e as suas relações com a política, com a fé, em regiões marcadas por diferenças religiosas. Além de professor e pesquisador, ele é editor associado da Real Research Perspectives in Religions and Psychology. E também foi professor visitante em diversas universidades em todo o mundo, inclusive na Índia, Indonésia, Filipinas, Brasil e África do Sul. Este movimento acadêmico, o internacional, enriqueceu suas perspectivas de pesquisa, cada vez mais o habilitando a abordar esses temas. Nós conhecemos o professor nos encontros bianuais da IAPR, a Associação Internacional de Psicologia da Religião, e já tivemos a oportunidade de recebê-lo num dos eventos organizados pelo GT de Psicologia da Religião, cujo presidente e vice-presidente estão aqui conosco, o vice-presidente Fátima Machado, da USP, Universidade de São Paulo, e nós tivemos então a oportunidade de recebê-lo em eventos organizados por esse GT em Cuiabá. E é uma alegria imensa tê-lo aqui conosco, novamente. E agora em Brasília, para fazer essa conferência de abertura do nosso Seminário Internacional de Sociedade de Saúde Mental e Pública. Muito bem-vindo. Muito obrigada por estar conosco.
Thank you for inviting me here. I'm glad to be here. As I guess one has said, my name is Hussein, professor from Sweden, and today I will talk about religious conflict. Can you hear me?
A B.
Yes.
Porque vocês não estão ouvindo.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Actually, I had planned to start by talking about conflicts in general. I think I will not do that. I think I will start in another, and I think I will go directly to the topic, namely religious conflicts. And I guess that I could do this in many different ways. But I would like to draw from my own research and from my own fieldwork. Some of you may find this familiar. You've heard it before, but I will tell the story once again for those of you not heard it. And I think it's important because we can, or you can, understand my thinking about emotions, identities, and what I hope to say in the end of this talk, namely that religious violence is moral. It is moral, not immoral. And I think it's a good idea to anyone going to translate this? Or? Are they translating right now? Okay. I got a little nervous here. I thought, I'm talking and no one is translating. So, but maybe you are much better in English, or of course you are, than I am in Portuguese. from my diary. And of course, you will be transported to another part of the world, to my second home, I would say, namely Indonesia. And this is what I wrote approximately 10 years ago. At the break of dawn, roughly 2,000 men gathered in a Muslim village in eastern Ambon. While many were locals, others had come from nearby villages, all armed and prepared for battle. They had received what they believed to be reliable information that the neighboring Christian village was planning an attack. And it was a familiar threat. This time, however, they decided to take the initiative and strike first. And by sunset, a 17-year-old boy had killed for the first time in his life. I have killed 6 people. The young man stated years later, his expression betraying no hint of remorse. But what had I expected? Tears? Certainly not. Yet the cold detachment in his voice, the absence of any empathy left me unsettled. It was as if they, or if violence was not something that seemed to be difficult for them. Still, they didn't want to engage in violence, but they felt they had to do so in order to do what is morally right. For them, killing wasn't easy, but it was necessary, driven by profound moral convictions and a desire to establish what they perceived to be an ideal social order. They did not need to dehumanize their victims. If anything, they humanized them, fully acknowledging their capacity for suffering and understanding the weight of that pain. In fact, it was this awareness of their victims' humanity that sharpened their resolve. They inflicted harm not out of ignorance, but with full comprehension, driven by the deliberate intent to make their violence purposeful and deeply impactful. We sat on the floor of a nearly empty mosque, talking quietly. Although we had met before, sharing meals and driving motorcycles through the conflict-ridden area, we didn't know each other very well. Still, I had heard fragments of his story, and out of curiosity, I asked, how did it feel to kill them. He replied without hesitation, if I hadn't killed the Christians, they would have killed me. They had attacked us before. It was retaliation, pure retaliation. Did you kill everyone in the village? Yes. Did you kill the women and children as well? No, only the men. We let the women and children escape. We sat in silence for a few moments. I was trying to make sense of it all when he added, we also let the elderly escape. We didn't kill old people, women, or children. Did you burn their homes? Yes, he said, and the church too. I nodded, still trying to grasp the full weight of his words. The conversation shifted. We talked about the weapons they had used, their allies, and the war in general. After about half an hour, I steered the discussion back to the day of the attack. Do you remember the day that you killed those people? Yeah, of course. What did it feel like to kill them? It was a strong feeling, he replied briefly. He then provided a detailed account of how the Christian troops had mutilated one of his friends and killed another one in front of his eyes. I was furious. What kind of weapons did you use? A sword. Did you kill them all with a sword? Yeah. 2 were killed inside and 4 outside the house. They had killed one of my friends. Was it out of revenge? Yeah. You mentioned having strong feelings that day. What kind of feelings were they? Fear? Anger? Contempt? I couldn't control my feelings. That's why I killed them. The emotions that day were strong, intense, and my anger certainly was present, motivated by perceived transgression against the in-group that demanded retribution, an eye for an eye. It seemed that, above all, he was actually consumed by a profound sadness. His violence appeared to stem less from rage and more from grief, a manifestation of mourning for relationships that had been shattered. Through killing, he not only proved himself as a courageous defender of his in-group, but also conveyed the depth of his attachment to those he had lost. The conflict in the Moluccas raged from 1999 to 2002, or maybe it was 2004. We don't really know for sure. And it was a religious war A former Lasker Jihad soldier told me during a focus group interview, and his friends nodded in agreement. And this sentiment was constantly echoed in my conversations with both Muslims and Christians in the province. It was a religious war. And the conflict was religious because Muslims killed Christians just because they were Christians, and Christians killed Muslims just because they were Muslims. Participants in the conflict did not embrace these religious divisions between them. They didn't embrace these ideas, divisions, because someone told them to do that. But they found this division reasonable in that situation. It was relevant, it was useful. And while religion was, of course, a dimension of the conflict in the Moluccas, the question remains, did religious beliefs, religious identities cause the conflict in the Moluccas? In my field diary, I wrote, who truly initiated the conflict? What were they fighting over? And who did what? Did believers, religious identities cause the conflict? Or were they a consequence of it? How did they come to believe that killing others is morally justified? The truth remains elusive, clouded by distorted memories. Yet one thing is unmistakably clear. The victims were carefully selected. A chilling logic governed their killings, and it ignored ethnicity, it ignored nationality, but not religion. Religious identity was the sole criterion. So this was for me the archetypal religious conflict, an interreligious conflict that I wanted to learn more about. So I started to travel to the region just 2 years after the conflict ended. Year after year after year, I went back to the Moluccas because I was a visiting professor at that time in Java. The conflict in the Moluccas is a typical example of what scholars sometimes identify as an identity-based conflict. An identity-based religious conflict is a conflict where the conflicting parties have different religious identities. There are Muslims killing Christians, Christians killing Hindus, and so on. Or Protestants killing Catholics, and Catholics killing Protestants. But the conflict is seldom about religion. But the conflicting parties are identified through religious labels. So actually, in fact, religion becomes a part of the conflict because people identify with one or the other of the conflicting parties. So religion was a part of the conflict, but the conflict was not about religion. And of course, the people in the Moluccas, like most people all over the world, they had multiple identities. They had ethnic identities, they had religious identities, and you can go on and count how many identities as possible. But in this situation, all of a sudden, religious identity became the most important one. And note, religious identity became a central concept in people's mind when their members of their own religious in-group were attacked. It was a threat against the religious in-group, and then religion became prominent in this context. All of these people had so many different religious identities, or not religious, social identities. But all of a sudden, it was just one identity that counted in this situation, and it was religious identity. You were either Muslim or Christian. And it is almost impossible to see on people if they are Muslims or Christians. But you can ask them. You can ask them to recite the confession, and you will see if they are Muslims or Christians. And they did so because they couldn't make the distinctions themselves. So they needed to know who should they kill. This conflict was a bloody conflict. It claimed maybe 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000. The bishop, the Catholic bishop in the region, told me 50,000. I think it's a little bit too high, but we don't know how many people were killed in this conflict. We don't know how many people actually had to flee their homes, but an estimated figure is about 500,000. So this was not a small conflict. Many people died, many people suffered in a region that is actually as big as some European countries, to be fact. And it's quite interesting because this conflict changed it all for me. I started to think in a new way about religious conflicts and about religious violence. I realized that it is not as easy as I thought when I started to study the conflicts. Before I entered the region for the first time in 2003 or 2004, I don't remember, I knew everything about the conflict. When I left, almost 10 years later, I knew hardly anything, more than it was very, very complicated. But it also became clear to me, or maybe I should say that first, was not the only conflict in Indonesia at this time. It started in 1999. At that time, we had an intensification of the conflict in Aceh, in the top of Sumatra. We had an ethnic conflict in Kalimantan. We had a religious conflict similar to the one in Maluku in central Sulawesi, in Poso. We had a religious conflict in Maluku. We had an intensification of the conflict in West Papua. We had an intensification, a violent and non-violent conflict in East Timor, or what would later become Timor-Leste. At the same time. And if we went to Europe, we had a conflict in the former Yugoslavia. So there were conflicts, and many of these conflicts were religious, or had a religious dimension. And they were violent. They were intense. They were prolonged, they were difficult to solve. They were enduring. And when scholars study these kind of conflicts, they have, and I think that is correct, they have said that identity is important. And I think it is. Religious identity is important. But is social identity fixed? Or is it fluid? To me, when I was studying conflict, the conflict in democracy, it became so clear to me that identities in conflicts are fluid. People studying religious conflicts tend to think or tend to argue or tend to disregard relation. Sorry for that. Sorry for that. I can do like this. Ah, thanks. Now I feel free. And yes, they tend to disregard relational dynamics. And what do I mean by that? They tend to miss an interesting fact that conflicts are relational. Of course, a religious conflict is relational in relation to God. It is a relation between a perpetrator and the victim. But it is also a relation between the perpetrator and the third party that is not involved. Maybe I'll kill the person because I want to end the relationship between that person and the third party. And also what I have found in my own research, sometimes I forgot about time. What time is, how much left? So will you give me a sign when I have 10 minutes left or something like that? Sometimes I forgot about the time. We show you 10, 5, and great. Great. So where, yeah. I have become more and more interested in the relational dynamics in religious conflicts. How people, what people are doing in conflict actually is related to their relations to so many partners at the same time. I've also become interested in something during the last, actually, I should be honest, I started to think about this during the last 6 months. I have become more and more interested in the fact that most perpetrators of religious violence actually think that they are doing something good, that their violence is moral. And because it is moral, they don't have to dehumanize their victims, because they're doing the right thing. How come people start to believe that their violent acts are moral? It's another thing that I have become more and more interested in. So, religious identity is a core concept. Or maybe I should say social identity, because I see religious identity as a type of social identity. And when you think about the conflict, maybe you think about incompatibilities between at least two actors. They are in conflict over something. Maybe you think that they also are doing something. You have conflict behavior. Conflict behavior can of course be both violent and non-violent. But in order to be a conflict, we must have two conflicting parties, at least two conflicting parties. People must actually divide themselves into social groups that hold hostile attitudes to each other. People must divide themselves into social groups. And religion can play a part here. Religion can play a part. Religion can shape conflicts. Religion shaped people's loyalties. What happened in the conflict in the Moluccas? Muslims were killing Christians, Christians were killing Muslims. And it didn't, in a very short time, the Muslims got support from other parts of Indonesia, of course, but also from other parts of the so-called Muslim world. And the Christian side, they got support from the United States and Christian groups in the United States. So, and we can see this over and over again. When religion becomes a part of conflict, Christians tend to support Christians, and Muslims tend to support Muslims, and Hindus tend to support Hindus, and so on. Support from abroad, but also nationally. So, social identity is important. Religious identity is important. And I think that, or I know that, the social identity approach can help us understand what is happening in religious conflicts. It can actually increase our understanding of religious conflicts. What is happening when people identify with a social group? The social identity approach. I think it's one of the most robust theories in social psychology, actually, the social identity approach. Because it explains that, as of course, the social identity approach claims that we have both personal and social identities. Personal identities guiding our private behavior, social identities guiding our group behavior. But I think what I found particularly interesting in this theory is that it is enough that we categorize ourselves as a member of a social group in order to show bias for our own interests and to discriminate against those who are not belonging to our group. We just have to self-categorize as a member of a social group. We just have to self-categorize as a member of a religious group in order to somehow think that we are better as Christians than Muslims, and so on. And there we have a ground for a conflict. So, social categorizations has an impact on our behavior, on our social cognition. It is quite obviously so. But once again, remember, we have many social identities, as in my case, a man, a member of the academy, one of the professors, husband, father, grandfather, which is the best part of it all. So I have so many social identities. And it is the context that actually determines which identity I will have at a specific time. And believe it or not, but I'm not behaving like this at home. I'm not behaving like this when I love ice hockey. You probably don't know what it is. But when I watch hockey, I behave in another way. I see the world in another way. So here we have the foundation for conflict. But remember now, these identities are fluid. They're not fixed. They change. I go from one social identity to another all the time. But it is the situation that actually determines which social identity I will have at a specific time, a specific situation. And religion remains a significant source of identity in the world. Most of the people in the world are religious. Remember that. Most people in the world are religious. So it is significant social identity in the world. And as a social identity, religion can have an impact on conflicts between groups. But it is also a matter of emotions. Don't think that conflicts are only about cognitions. It is also about emotions. Emotions that people feel. And intergroup emotions theory complements, or some would say, is a part of the social identity approach. But it focuses on or examines how emotions associated with group memberships, for instance, empathy, for instance, compassion, for instance, anger, how they emerge and influence behavior. Group-based emotions. We see them in all conflicts. So, according to intergroup emotions theory, it is quite obvious that categorizing ourselves as a member of a social group not only has an impact on how we perceive the world, how we behave, but also our emotions. To be member of a particular group is to often exhibit a particular type of emotions. This has an impact on religious conflicts. People feel, people experience group-based emotions. And of course, people vary in the extent to which they categorize themselves into groups. So for some, self-categorization into a specific religious group is more pronounced than others and holds a greater social and emotional significance, which has consequences leading to experience group-based emotions more intensely than others. What I have become thanks. Still have 100 minutes, so I think, or something like that. Group-based emotions actually infuse religious beliefs, religious identities, with the power to motivate people to take action in defense of their community, to take action to protect their in-group members, but also to defend and propagate their faith. Group-based emotions motivate people to take actions. But I'm back to the important question. How is the relationship between religion, or religious identity, and intergroup emotions and conflicts? Are they causing conflicts, or are they outcomes of conflicts? It is, of course, a very complicated question. I can't answer it. But what I have found is that people in situations tend to adopt belligerent religious IDs, tend to adopt belligerent religious identities. So sometimes when I want to provoke people, I used to say, no, religious belief does not cause conflict, but conflict causes religion. And what do I mean by that? Yeah, conflicts in themselves have tremendous effects on people. Actually creating divisions, or actually helping people, or making people to think that it is more reasonable to adopt a specific religious identity than another one. So religious identity, and it became quite obvious. I will take an example. I was so surprised when I started to interview Muslims and Christians in the Lucas, because when I asked them about their religious lives, they told me something interesting. Most of them. They said something like this. Before the conflict, now I'm referring to a Muslim who participated in conflict and said, can you describe your religious life before the conflict? Yeah, I didn't practice Islam. We were heavy drinkers on Saturday nights and often drank with Christians and so on and so on. And how was your religious life during the conflict? I prayed 5 times a day. And they were quite observant in their religious faith. And it was the same thing with Christians. And then when I talked to them some years after the conflict, I said, now, how is it now? And they used to say, it's like before the conflict. So I started to realize that religion became prominent during conflicts. Not because, so the conflict was not caused by religion, but conflict in itself caused religion in one way or another, which is not particularly strange because armed conflicts are terrible. People feeling anxiety, they are afraid. And what to do? Identify with a religious group. So, now I just have 1 minute. So I will just say something very short about the moral aspect of it. Namely the fact that I also come to realize, of course, can you imagine that you at the same time are involved in various kinds of social relationships? In some relationships are maybe more authoritarian or authority structured. Other ones are more equality structured, and others are, and so on. At the same time. And it became quite obvious to me that some who participate in religious conflict, they're doing it in obedience. In obedience, they experience it as if God commands them to use violence. And if God commands them to use violence, it is moral. And in a conflict situation, it is not just me who think it's moral. It is my in-group who confirms the fact that it is moral. But in most religious conflicts, people also use violence in conflict situations because they have, in order to do that, they are superior. They didn't want to do it. They do it because they must obey orders, like in ordinary conflicts. Or they use violence in order to establish a hierarchy within the in-group. The 17-year-old boy I was talking about. It was so obvious when I talked to his friends and the community that he was well respected because of the killings. So his status was high within the group because of the killings. But it was also quite obvious that he killed because he had a feeling of unity with his in-group. He defended his in-group. And to defend one's in-group, most people think is moral. Morally acceptable. And I could continue, believe me. But it's so interesting to see that religious violence is what I say nowadays, call it meta-relational. There are and most scholars, they actually only focus on the relation to God. But I think it's almost as important the relationship to other people within their in-group, but also in relation to the out-group, and so on. Do I have to stop now?
Yeah.
Still 1 minute. Oh. So what have I forgotten? So you can see that they have the authority ranking relationships, it's structured and has an impact on people's behavior. And also it's a relational model that actually makes some kinds of violence morally acceptable. But it's not only about the hierarchy, it's also about equality. Because it was quite obvious when the 17-year-old boy was explaining his conflict behavior that he killed 6 people. He did so in relation to the fact that they had killed one of them. So, and it continues like that. I think I stopped there. Thank you.
Obrigado, professor. E para agradecer, formalmente, nós convidamos a professora Marta para entregar um presente do Congresso do Seminário de Professor Thomas, então.
Esse moço tem o som da voz de Douglas. Na hora que ele fala,
Thank you.
obrigada, professor Thomas. Ele fala de dança politicamente, emocionalmente. E eu sei que certamente o conteúdo da fala do ponto de vista psicológico propaga ao longo do dia, e nosso horário de almoço hoje já ficou bem apertado, eu anuncio que a gente não vai ter as questões, mas isso não vai acontecer tão demais, né? Sempre na abertura a gente acaba